Not vaguely, specifically. You remember it the way you remember certain things from childhood that had a physical intensity to them. The way the cold air hit you coming in from the parking lot. The way the light inside was different from the light outside. The way the noise of the world behind you disappeared and was replaced by something else entirely. You remember looking up and seeing aisles that seemed to go on forever in every direction. Aisles taller than you were, taller than your parents were, stacked from floor to ceiling with every color that existed. You remember the smell of new plastic and cardboard and something synthetic and bright that you couldn't name, but that your brain immediately and permanently filed under the category of happiness. You remember knowing the moment you walked in that whatever was about to happen next was going to be the best part of your week. If you grew up in America between roughly 1970 and 2000, Toys R Us was not a store you went to. It was an event, it was a destination, it was the place your brain went when someone said the word treat, the word reward, the word birthday, the word Christmas. Other stores sold toys. Toys R Us was toys. The entire physical manifestation of the concept, gathered under one roof, organized into a world so complete and overwhelming that children regularly became overstimulated just from the act of standing inside it. And then it was gone. Not slowly gone the way some things fade. Gone in a specific, dateable, documented way. The stores closed. The shelves were emptied. The Jeffrey the Giraffe signs came down. The building sat empty or got converted into something else. Furniture stores, fitness centers, grocery stores, places that sold perfectly reasonable things to perfectly reasonable adults who had no idea what had happened in that space before. And millions of Americans felt something when it happened that was genuinely hard to explain to anyone who hadn't felt it. A specific grief for something that was, when you said it plainly, a retail chain. A place that sold manufactured goods at marked up prices to parents with disposable income. When you described it that way, it sounded absurd to mourn. But people mourned it anyway, because what they were actually mourning was not the store. It was what the store had meant. It was the specific quality of joy it had produced in them at an age when joy had that particular pure and uncomplicated texture that it never quite has again. To understand all of that, to understand how something that produced that kind of feeling in that many people ended the way it ended, you have to go back to the very beginning. And the beginning, like most great American retail stories, starts with one person who saw something that nobody else was seeing yet. His name was Charles Lazarus. He was born in 1923 in Washington, D.C. His father ran a bicycle repair shop. Charles grew up working in that shop, learning the rhythms of retail from the ground up, how to talk to customers, how to manage inventory, how to think about what people wanted and how to give it to them. He served in World War II, came home in 1945, and started thinking about what to do next. What he noticed in 1945 and 1946 was babies, specifically the extraordinary number of babies being born to returning veterans and their wives. The baby boom was not yet a recognized cultural phenomenon. That term and that analysis came later, but Lazarus could see it happening in real time. Young couples everywhere, young families forming everywhere, and all of those families were going to need things for their children. He opened a baby furniture store in Washington, D.C. in 1948. Children's Bargain Town, he called it. It sold cribs, strollers, high chairs, the furniture of early childhood. And it did reasonably well. But Lazarus noticed something almost immediately. Parents who came in to buy furniture kept asking about toys. They were already there. They had their wallets out. They wanted to buy something for their kids, and toys were a natural extension of the trip. So he added toys. And the toys sold better than the furniture. He paid attention to that signal. He kept expanding the toy selection and contracting the furniture selection, and at some point in the early 1950s, the store had effectively become a toy store that also sold some baby furniture rather than the other way around. Lazarus was not precious about the original concept. He followed what the customers were telling him with their purchasing decisions. And what they were telling him was that they wanted a store that was dedicated to toys, that had a serious and comprehensive selection of toys, that treated toys as the main event rather than a sideline. In 1957, he opened a store he called Toys R Us. The backwards R was his idea, a visual joke, a nod to the way children wrote before they had fully mastered the alphabet. It was memorable and slightly silly and completely perfect for what he was selling. People remembered it. Children recognized it. The logo was friendly and a little chaotic in the way that children themselves are friendly and a little chaotic. The concept was genuinely new, not incrementally new, categorically new. Before Toys R Us, toys were sold in department stores. You'd go to Sears or J.C. Penney or Macy's, and there would be a toy section, a floor or a portion of a floor, well stocked at Christmas, not particularly interesting the rest of the year. The selection was decent, but not extraordinary. The staff knew about as much about toys as they knew about the towels and the luggage and the housewares they also sold. Toys were a category within a larger store, given exactly as much space and attention and investment as the category warranted relative to everything else. What Lazarus was proposing was a store where toys were not a category. Toys were everything. The entire space, the entire staff, the entire operation, all of it pointed at one thing. You could carry a selection that no department store could match because you weren't competing internally with every other category for shelf space and floor space and buyer attention. You could price competitively because you were buying at greater volume in a single category than any department store could. You could hire people who actually knew and cared about toys. You could create an experience designed specifically around the act of choosing a toy, rather than an experience designed around the act of shopping for everything. The superstore concept, applied to toys. That was the idea. It sounds obvious in retrospect. Most great retail ideas sound obvious in retrospect. Lazarus spent the 1960s developing the model, opening more locations, refining the operation, and in 1966 he sold a small chain to the Interstate Stores Company, staying on to run it. Then Interstate went bankrupt in 1974, and Lazarus, in one of the great individual acts of retail determination in American business history, used the bankruptcy proceedings as an opportunity to essentially rescue the toy store chain from the wreckage of the parent company. He restructured it, took it independent, and relaunched it with a renewed focus and a clear growth strategy. In 1978, Toys R Us went public on the New York Stock Exchange, and then it grew, fast, relentlessly, in a way that mirrored the suburban expansion of America itself. The stores that went up in the late 1970s and through the 1980s were a specific kind of American commercial architecture that anyone who lived through that era will recognize immediately. A large, freestanding, single-story building, usually in a strip mall or a power center, usually with a massive parking lot in front. A distinctive color scheme, primary colors, bright and bold. The Geoffrey the Giraffe logo on the sign, and on the bags and on the receipts, and if you were lucky enough to visit on the right day, walking around the store in full costume, enormous and slightly terrifying and beloved. Geoffrey the Giraffe. Let's stop for a moment on Geoffrey because he deserves it. Introduced in the 1960s and refined over the decades into an iconic character, Geoffrey was the mascot who personified what the store was supposed to feel like. Friendly, tall enough to see everything, at home in this place that was built for play. Children had complicated feelings about Geoffrey in the way that children have complicated feelings about all large costume characters. A mixture of genuine delight and low-grade existential uncertainty about what exactly was inside there. But they loved him anyway. Geoffrey appeared in commercials, on packaging, in promotional materials, and in stores. He was the face of something that didn't need a face to succeed, but was unmistakably better with one. The commercials. You remember the commercials. I don't want to grow up, I'm a Toys R Us kid. That jingle. If you are of a certain age, that melody is in your head right now, and it will not leave for the next several hours, and you are welcome. It debuted in 1982 and ran for years in various forms, and it captured something real about the emotional proposition of the store. It wasn't just selling toys. It was selling the idea of childhood itself, the idea that childhood was a place you could visit, that joy was available and specific and located at a particular address. The children in those commercials weren't just happy, they were overwhelmed with happy, running down aisles, grabbing things off shelves, eyes wide, unable to process the abundance around them. That was not a fantasy the advertising had invented. That was an accurate documentary of what it felt like to be a child inside a Toys R Us. The stores were organized in a way that, to a child, felt like a complete world with its own geography. You learned the layout of your particular store the way you learned the layout of your neighborhood. The landmarks, the sections, the specific spots where the things you cared most about lived. Bikes near the back, or sometimes outside. Board games in their own section, stacked in those familiar flat boxes with the photographs of smiling families on the front. Video games, this section growing dramatically through the 1980s and into the 1990s. Usually behind glass at a counter near the back, the cartridges and later the discs in their cases, the Nintendo section, and then the Sega section, and the whole ongoing war of the console era playing out on those shelves. Action figures in their own aisle, pegs hanging from the wall with every character in the line, the blister pack packaging with its bright colors and dramatic poses. Dolls in another aisle entirely, outdoor toys, sports equipment, stuffed animals, arts and crafts, remote control cars, science kits, building sets. The building sets had their own particular gravity, especially from the late 1970s onward, when LEGO was expanding its licensed themes and adding layer after layer of new complexity and possibility. You could spend 20 minutes just in the LEGO aisle, picking up boxes, reading the piece counts, looking at the pictures of completed sets, calculating with the particular math of childhood. The math of what was possible given what you were allowed to ask for and what you might reasonably receive. Because that was always the other dimension of a Toys R Us visit. The negotiation, the parental constraint, the difference between what was available in that store and what you were actually going to leave with. Parents had their own relationship with Toys R Us, and it was somewhat more complicated than their children's relationship with it. The abundance that made children's eyes go wide made parents do a different kind of calculation. This is a $60 toy. We said we would spend $30. That one is $25, but it seems flimsy. That one is $40 and seems like it would actually last. Maybe we can come back closer to the birthday. Maybe we should have not brought them with us today. The negotiations that happened in those aisles between parents and children, the bargaining, the lobbying, the strategic deployment of patience and disappointment by children who had refined these skills through years of practice, these were a ritual of American family life as real and recurring as any other. And at Christmas. At Christmas, Toys R Us was something else entirely. The parking lot was a war zone in the best possible sense. Cars circling, waiting for spaces, people pushing carts piled higher than seemed structurally advisable. Lines at the registers that snaked back through the store. The shelves in a state of constant replenishment. Employees moving through the crowds with boxes of stock trying to stay ahead of the demand. The noise level was something you could feel physically. Hundreds of families, children and adults. The high collective energy of a space that was processing a concentrated burst of American consumer desire in the weeks before December 25th. And the hot toy. Every Christmas had one. Or two. The toy that everyone had seen on television. The toy that every child in the country had put at the top of the list. The toy that was sold out everywhere before December even started, and whose absence from shelves produced a specific parental panic that became, every year, its own news story. Cabbage Patch Kids in 1983, Transformers, He-Man, Nintendo Entertainment Systems in the mid-1980s when you literally could not find one anywhere. Tickle Me Elmo in 1996. Furby, Pokemon cards at the turn of the millennium. These toy frenzies were a cultural phenomenon that Toys R Us sat at the center of. If you were going to find it anywhere, you were going to find it at Toys R Us. Or you were going to be told by a Toys R Us employee, with a mix of genuine sympathy and slight exhaustion, that they had sold their last one 3 days ago, and they didn't know when they were getting more. Through the 1980s, the company was one of the great retail success stories in American business. It expanded internationally, into Europe, into Japan, into Canada, into Australia, into markets across the world where the big box toy store concept was just as compelling as it had been in America. By the late 1980s, Toys R Us had over 1,000 stores worldwide. It had spawned companion chains. Kids R Us for clothing, Babies R Us for infant and toddler goods, the latter of which would prove to be one of the more resilient parts of the overall enterprise. Charles Lazarus had built something that dominated its category so thoroughly that the category and the company were effectively synonymous. When Americans thought about buying a toy, not a gift, specifically a toy, they thought about Toys R Us. The brand recognition was nearly total. The market share was extraordinary. Competitors existed, but none of them were really in the same conversation. KB Toys in the malls, Children's Palace, a handful of regional chains, they all operated in the shadow of the giant. And then, in the 1990s, things began to change, slowly at first, in ways that were easy to rationalize or explain away. And then faster than that, until the speed of the change made the earlier slowness seem almost willful. The first challenge came from an unexpected direction, not from another toy company, from general merchandise. Walmart had been expanding through the 1980s from its regional base in the South and Midwest, and by the early 1990s was going national in a serious way. And Walmart had toys, not a toy store, a toy department within a massive general merchandise store that carried everything from groceries to automotive supplies to electronics. The toy department at Walmart was not as large as Toys R Us, not as comprehensive, not as expertly curated, but it was good enough for a lot of purchases. And Walmart's prices were lower, sometimes significantly lower, because Walmart's entire operating model was built around extracting cost from every corner of the supply chain and passing it to the customer as price savings. And toys were just another category where that model applied. Target was doing the same thing. Kmart was doing the same thing. And as these enormous general merchandise chains spread across suburban America, they started taking sales. Not all of Toys R Us's sales, but enough. The routine purchase, the birthday present for a party next weekend, the small toy to keep a child occupied on a long car trip, the replacement for something that had broken. These started migrating to wherever was most convenient. And convenient often meant Walmart or Target because those stores were already part of the weekly shopping routine.